su interés en participar en instancias como esta, que nos permiten reencontrarnos para compartir y aprender nuevas evidencias, que nos permiten avanzar en hacer de nuestras comunidades, barrios y ciudades espacios más seguros para todos y todas. Les recordamos que están habilitadas en la plataforma de Zoom la función de traducción en 2 idiomas, inglés y español. El icono para activarlo lo encontrarán en la parte inferior de sus pantallas. Es un globo. Por otra parte, durante las charlas magistrales de nuestros invitados, todos quienes nos acompañan podrán participar haciéndonos llegar sus preguntas a través del botón Preguntas y Respuestas. Según el tiempo con el que contemos al finalizar de las charlas, nuestro equipo seleccionará y sintetizará las preguntas que nos hayan hecho llegar. También pueden compartir sus impresiones por sus redes sociales usando el hashtag #ConferenciaFPC. Dicho esto, sean todos muy bienvenidos. Damos comienzo a la primera jornada de la 12ª Conferencia Internacional Desafíos para la Seguridad en nuestras ciudades, Gestión de Territorios para Prevención del Delito y de la Violencia. Dándole la palabra al director ejecutivo de Fundación Ciudadana, Daniel Johnson Rodríguez. Bienvenido, Daniel, muy buenos días. Daniel, no te escuchamos. Disculpa, estás muteado aún. No te escuchamos. Francisco, por favor, ¿podrías habilitar a Daniel?
¿Ahí se escucha o no?
¿Sí? Ahora te escuchamos perfecto, Daniel.
Bienvenido. Me decía que tenían que habilitarme para poder hacerlo, disculpen. Bueno, muchas gracias, Gail, por tus palabras iniciales. Primero, bueno, decirles que es un honor para mí inaugurar esta nueva conferencia internacional de seguridad ciudadana que hemos denominado Desafíos de la Seguridad en nuestras ciudades, Gestión de los Territorios para la Prevención de los Delitos y la Violencia. Es un honor porque es un aporte tangible del trabajo que hacemos día a día en Fundación Ciudadana para mejorar la seguridad en nuestro país, pero también porque es un trabajo conjunto entre múltiples instituciones nacionales e internacionales que demuestra que es posible, pero también que es necesario abordar la seguridad en forma integral. Quiero entonces comenzar estas palabras saludando a las autoridades y representantes de las instituciones que nos han acompañado y que lo harán durante la conferencia. Ministro del Interior y Seguridad Pública, señor Rodrigo Delgado, Subsecretario del Interior, señor Juan Francisco Gali, Subsecretaria de Prevención del Delito, señora María José Gómez, Fiscal Nacional del Ministerio Público, señor Jorge Abbott, General Director de Carabineros de Chile, señor Ricardo Yáñez, Director General de la Policía de Investigaciones de Chile, señor Sergio Muñoz, Gobernador Regional Metropolitano de Santiago, señor Claudio Arrego, representantes de instituciones nacionales e internacionales vinculadas a la seguridad, funcionarios de estas instituciones, académicos, estudiantes y equipo de Fundación Ciudadana. Esta es nuestra 12ª conferencia internacional, un recorrido ininterrumpido de más de una década que nos ha permitido profundizar en conocimiento, lazos y compromiso, pero también periodo en el que hemos visto profundizarse necesidades y anhelos de seguridad que deben ser atendidos de forma urgente. En la última encuesta del Centro de Estudios Públicos de nuestro país, la seguridad se mantiene como la primera necesidad que nuestras familias manifiestan que debe ser atendida por los gobiernos. Y esto muestra, primero, que las familias sienten que es necesario y urgente sentirse seguras. Y en segundo lugar, que los ciudadanos consideran que no es posible alcanzar esta seguridad individualmente, que se requiere acciones colectivas, de bien común, que deben ser lideradas por los gobiernos e implementadas conjuntamente. Por su parte, según los resultados del índice Paz Ciudadana, que presentamos la semana pasada, los chilenos nos estamos sintiendo inseguros, consideramos que la delincuencia ha aumentado y pensamos que lo va a seguir haciendo en los próximos meses. Y esto afecta las condiciones de vida de nuestras familias. Su bienestar se condiciona. En esta misma encuesta se vio que más del 90% de las familias chilenas han realizado acciones para estar más seguras. Entre ellas han dejado salir a ciertos lugares y a ciertas horas, limitando severamente sus libertades. Nos hemos empeñado como país en intentar aumentar el bienestar de nuestros ciudadanos. Hemos construido áreas verdes, hemos mejorado los sistemas de transporte, entre muchas otras acciones. Sin embargo, estas acciones no tendrán éxito si estos lugares y estos sistemas de transporte, por ejemplo, no son percibidos como seguros. Y de esa manera se limita su capacidad de entregar los beneficios para los cuales fueron diseñados. Debemos entonces considerar criterios de seguridad en la planificación de nuestras ciudades y comunas, buscando controlar y revertir las condiciones que generan inseguridad, como la segregación, la falta de servicios, y dar a los nuevos barrios condiciones preventivas, desde su infraestructura, a la prevención que hacemos desde las familias para vivir, a la preparación, perdón, que hacemos de las familias para vivir en estos barrios. Para mejorar la situación delictual, debemos buscar los caminos más efectivos, los mangos bajitos, como me dicen que se dice en Colombia. Y estos muchas veces se distancian de lo que nos indica la intuición. Es fundamental mirar las experiencias de otros, ver cuáles iniciativas han sido exitosas en otros lugares y copiarlas con orgullo, porque de esa manera estaremos siendo responsables y avanzando con certeza hacia una mayor seguridad. En estos momentos convulsionados debemos mirar con atención lo que está sucediendo y, entre otras cosas que nos dejó la pandemia, está el entendimiento de que para avanzar más rápido a veces debemos esperar. Y lo hicimos con paciencia para tener la certeza que las vacunas no hacían daño y que eran efectivas para cada edad. Esta conciencia es la que necesitamos para implementar políticas públicas basadas en evidencia y en particular en materias de seguridad y justicia. Debemos imitar en seguridad lo que la salud aprendió hace varias décadas. La pandemia también nos mostró cómo los cambios de comportamiento afectan el delito. Menos personas en la calle y más familias en su casa hicieron que disminuyeran los robos de manera muy importante. Sin embargo, esta disminución se concentró en delitos menos violentos y que en general producen menos daño, como los hurtos y robos por sorpresa. Por su parte, no disminuyeron los robos con violencia e intimidación y aumentaron los homicidios. Esta diferencia en la evolución de diferentes delitos nos muestran que no basta con contar ilícitos para dimensionar la evolución de la delincuencia en un territorio. Debemos también entender el daño que cada uno de ellos produce. Es por esto que en Paz Ciudadana hemos trabajado en el índice de daño del delito, que lo hemos traído desde un trabajo anterior de la Universidad de Cambrigde, que pondera cada uno de ellos por las penas establecidas en nuestra legislación, herramienta que esperamos comience a utilizarse cada vez con más frecuencia para tomar decisiones en la implementación de políticas públicas. Este tipo de herramientas deben permitir gestionar de forma más efectiva nuestro sistema de seguridad y justicia para que con los recursos disponibles, que siempre serán limitados, podamos obtener los mejores resultados en la disminución del delito y la violencia y, más importante aún, el daño que estos generan. También debemos ser capaces de focalizar nuestras políticas en quienes están siendo más víctimas. El mismo índice Paz Ciudadana citado anteriormente nos mostró que las mujeres que se clasifican en un nivel de temor alto duplican a los hombres en este segmento. Que el temor también se concentra mayoritariamente en la región metropolitana y en los grupos socioeconómicos de nivel más bajo, que coincide también con quienes son más víctimas de delitos. Pero no basta con tener más datos, ni incluso más y mejor información a partir de estos datos. Debemos desarrollar las capacidades para utilizarlas correctamente en todos los niveles de decisión y en todos los ámbitos, incluyendo el poder legislativo, quienes deben normar en base a evidencia y garantizar mediciones de implementación e incluso de impacto de las leyes que promulgan. Del nivel central también, del Ejecutivo, cuando se define la Política Nacional de Seguridad Pública y esta se materializa a través de las acciones de nuestras policías y de todos los elementos del sistema de seguridad y justicia que pertenecen al Ejecutivo. A nivel regional también, con la planificación territorial y la priorización del financiamiento de iniciativas locales desde los gobiernos regionales. Y por supuesto en el nivel local, donde se deben impulsar programas preventivos de violencias y delitos en función de las necesidades de cada territorio. Para esto, hemos impulsado desde Paz Ciudadana nuestro programa de observatorios comunales de seguridad, que permiten el correcto diagnóstico de los problemas que aquejan a cada territorio, la selección y diseño de políticas públicas que sean efectivas, el monitoreo de su implementación y su posterior evaluación, que permita profundizar las que son exitosas y reformular e incluso interrumpir las que no generan los beneficios esperados o incluso pudieran generar perjuicios inesperados. Pero como para lograr esta capacidad de gestión de la seguridad, es necesario también que las autoridades centrales, regionales y comunales prioricen las acciones más efectivas en disminuir el delito, la violencia y la inseguridad. Acciones que en momentos pudieran no ser las más populares. Es fundamental entonces tener una mirada integral, que no considere casi exclusivamente la persecución y su fortalecimiento como la herramienta base para mejorar la seguridad. Debemos lograr una mirada sistémica, que considere acciones preventivas desde las tempranas, que se hacen a cargo de los factores de riesgo de inicio de conducta infractora, promoviendo factores protectores que las contengan. La disuasión eficiente del delito, la persecución inteligente, buscando la desarticulación de sistemas delictuales, un sistema de penas efectivo en la incapacitación para la comisión de nuevos delitos mientras se cumplen las condenas, pero fundamentalmente en la reinserción, a través de la identificación de las causas del involucramiento delictual para tratarlas y evitar así la reincidencia. Todo esto es posible si aprendemos de otras experiencias y priorizamos nuestras acciones correctamente. La conferencia de este año coincide en Chile con un periodo de campaña para las próximas elecciones, donde se definirán nuestras autoridades y esperamos poder influir directamente en los programas de gobierno y en su posterior implementación. Para lograrlo, hemos planificado 4 acciones concretas. La primera de ellas, que se llevó a cabo hace 2 semanas, fue la entrega a los comandos de cada candidato presidencial de una lista de 22 propuestas para mejorar el desempeño del sistema de seguridad y justicia chileno. La segunda fue la realización de la encuesta de victimización, conocida como el Índice Paz Ciudadana, que entregamos sus resultados la semana recién pasada, que nos permite evaluar la situación de inseguridad de nuestro país. La tercera es este seminario que estamos organizando hoy, en el que podremos revisar estudios y experiencias internacionales exitosas. Y la cuarta, que realizaremos en las próximas semanas, es nuestro consejo consultivo, en el cual esperamos contar con la presencia de los candidatos presidenciales con mayor probabilidad de ser electos, para que nos expliquen en detalle sus iniciativas en materia de seguridad y justicia, y podamos evaluar las bases que cada una de ellas considera y su probabilidad de producir cambios relevantes. Esperamos que nuestra 12ª conferencia internacional sea aprovechada por muchos como un lugar de encuentro, en que miramos con atención las últimas investigaciones que se están desarrollando en otros lugares del mundo y experiencias prácticas de iniciativas exitosas. Esperamos que estas insumen los programas de gobierno de todos los candidatos que se encuentran compitiendo por liderar nuestro país, para que logremos avanzar a paso firme hacia un país y un continente más seguro. Hemos preparado con gran entusiasmo 3 días de conferencia y estamos orgullosos de contar con invitados del primer nivel internacional que desde su conocimiento centrarán su mirada por unos días en nuestro país, permitiéndonos profundizar en el entendimiento del delito y en acciones efectivas para disminuir su ocurrencia y la inseguridad que genera, aspectos fundamentales para nuestro desarrollo. Hoy, 19 de octubre y primer día de la conferencia, centraremos nuestra mirada en los desafíos para la prevención, como nos contaba Gail hace unos minutos, y nos acompañarán en el análisis Manuel Eisner, profesor de Criminología y director del Centro de Investigación de Violencia del Instituto de Criminología de la Universidad de Cambridge, y más tarde Débora Ketze, profesora del Departamento de Justicia Criminal John Jay College de Justicia Criminal e investigadora del Instituto Correccional de la Universidad de Cincinnati. Mañana, 20 de octubre, abordaremos el tema de violencia y delincuencia en barrios y ciudades. Y estarán con nosotros Thomas Abt, presidente del Grupo de Trabajo sobre Delitos Violentos del Consejo de Justicia Criminal de Estados Unidos, quien también dirigió recientemente la Comisión Nacional sobre COVID-19 y de Justicia Penal en el mismo consejo. Y mañana, en la tarde, un poco más tarde, nos acompañará Alejandro Echeverri, cofundador y director del Centro de Estudios Urbanos y Ambientales Urban de la Universidad, EAFIT de Medellín. Finalmente, este jueves 21 de octubre trataremos el tema El cambio cultural como centro de las reformas policiales, y nos acompañarán en la reflexión Loren Sherman, director de investigación del Centro Jerry Lee para la Criminología Experimental y director del Programa Ejecutivo de Policías de Cambridge, y posteriormente Edward McGuire, profesor de Criminología y Justicia Penal de la Universidad Estatal de Arizona, donde también se desempeña como director del Laboratorio de Innovación en Seguridad Pública. Sin duda tenemos la oportunidad de escuchar y conversar con un extraordinario nivel de expositores. Y no puedo terminar estas palabras sin agradecer a quienes lo han hecho posible. Primero, a nuestro coorganizador, Motorola Solution Foundation, al Ministerio del Interior, a la Fiscalía Nacional, Carabineros de Chile y las Policías e Investigaciones de Chile, quienes patrocinan esta conferencia, y en particular al equipo de Fundación Ciudadana, que ha puesto toda su energía y cariño para hacernos vivir estas jornadas de profunda reflexión. Entonces los dejo invitados a participar activamente en todas las actividades que estaremos desarrollando durante los próximos 3 días, y ahora, en particular, a esta primera charla que inaugurará esta conferencia con el destacado profesor Manuel Eisner. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos.
Agradecemos las palabras del director ejecutivo de Fundación Ciudadana, Daniel Johnson, y a continuación presentaremos el saludo que la Subsecretaría de Prevención del Delito, María José Gómez, nos ha hecho llegar, quien por razones de fuerza mayor no nos ha podido acompañar el día de hoy. Francisco, por favor, transmite el video.
Quiero enviar un afectuoso saludo a todos quienes participan en esta 12ª conferencia internacional que apunta a la prevención del delito en los territorios y que fue organizada por la Fundación Ciudadana. En nuestra subsecretaría sabemos que este es un tema de la máxima importancia. Por eso, hoy estamos llevando adelante una serie de iniciativas para la prevención del delito y para avanzar en seguridad en los barrios que tienen una perspectiva enfocada en el territorio y en la participación de las personas. Me habría encantado acompañarlos presencialmente en esta actividad, lamentablemente razones de agenda me lo impiden, pero les deseo el mayor de los éxitos en las 3 jornadas que tienen por delante y en las que van a tener un objetivo que compartimos, que es hacer de nuestras ciudades un mejor lugar para vivir.
A continuación, tengo el honor de presentarles a Manuel Eisner, profesor Wolfson de Criminología y director del Centro de Investigación de Violencia del Instituto de Criminología de la Universidad de Cambrigde, cuya presentación está titulada como Evidence for Better Lives, Evidencia para Vidas Mejores. El profesor Eisner expondrá en inglés, por lo que para aquellos que les resulte más cómodo se encuentra habilitada la función de traducción al castellano. Muchas gracias, profesor Eisner, y sea muy bienvenido el día de hoy.
So thank you very much for this introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to all of you about some of the work that I'm doing. I will primarily try to emphasize today how important it is to think about the entire life course of human beings from birth into adulthood as the focus of crime prevention. One of the questions that one can ask is, what are the main basic strategies through which crime and violence can be reduced and security increased? And the way I think about it is to distinguish 3 main pillars. The first pillar are crime control strategies. The second pillar are strategies that aim at changing opportunities and situations. And the third pillar are strategies that aim to change motivations and propensities. So under crime control strategies, we mean strategies such as better and more effective policing, strategies that aim at deterrence and incapacitation, strategies that include monitoring and surveillance such as CCTV cameras, for example, or more police patrols on streets, but also strategies that aim at reintegration of offenders in order to reduce reoffending. Strategies that change opportunities and situations are strategies that are linked to the costs and benefits of committing a crime. So this includes, for example, burglar alarms, locks, or CCTV cameras that are aimed at making it harder for perpetrators to commit a crime. Reducing access to weapons is one of the strategies here. Changing profits that one can accrue from committing crimes, such as profits from drug trafficking. And finally, it's important to bear in mind that much of this these days depends on using technologies to change and reduce opportunities for committing crime. And finally, there is a bundle of strategies that aims to change motivations and propensities. This includes moral beliefs, such as gender norms, or beliefs about the wrongfulness of committing crime, or the beliefs in the police and the moral order of society. It includes strategies that aim at changing something like self-control and long-term planning, strategies that aim to change adversities and reduce anger, and strategies that aim to improve mental health and well-being, because there are so many findings that show that crime is related to poor mental well-being. In my talk today, I will focus on the motivations and propensities. I would like to start with asking you all a question. Who is this young gentleman here who looks at us with a rather stern view? Now, this young gentleman a few years later looked like this. He was a little bit of a person who was often involved in some fights. You can also see that he looked quite dashing. He's known to have had quite a lot of girlfriends, often in the short run, but he was also a gang member, very active. I don't know whether you can already guess who it was. It was Stalin, one of the greatest mass murderers in human history. If you think about this, it may be interesting to briefly remember some of the features and some of the context in which Stalin grew up. According to Simon Montefiore, Stalin's father, who was called Crazy Bezo, was an alcoholic cobbler. His mother, Keke, spoiled Stalin, but at the same time, she beat him mercilessly. Bezo, who regularly beat up Stalin as a child, sometimes beat him so hard that there was blood in the child's urine for days. And one of the schoolmates, Joseph Iremashvili, said that the undeserved beatings made the boy as hard and heartless as the father himself. This leads us straight away to questions that are at the core of developmental prevention. At what age do antisocial behavior, crime, and violence start? At what time in human development is the beginning of careers and developments that are linked to crime and violence? What are the risk and protective factors during childhood that predict adolescent and adult criminality? Is it possible to reduce adolescent and adult criminality by addressing these childhood risk factors and strengthening protective factors, strengthening resilience? And how can we examine the effectiveness of these early prevention and intervention programs? Always bearing in mind that if we try to intervene early in human life, it takes many, many years and sometimes decades to find out whether they have been effective. Another way to think about it is to ask the question, could Stalin really have been prevented with a proper early prevention program delivered in late 19th century Georgia? And if I ask this question, I mean, my answer would probably be not necessarily. And of course, human history and human structures and politics played an important role. But there might be a role in reducing the damages that Stalin was exposed to, and hence probably changing the kind of personality that he was. I will focus mainly in my rest of my talk on individual level targets of developmental crime prevention. And I would like to focus on strengths that humans acquire as they grow older. In my view, an important way to think about this, or one possible way to think about this, is to distinguish 4 skills that humans acquire as they grow older. One is cognitive skills, skills such as self-control, or skills that are also known as executive functioning, long-term planning, and the ability to assess the consequences of what one is doing. A second domain are emotional skills, skills not to have emotions, but to control emotions, to regulate emotions, and to use them in a productive way. Anger control is one important element. Then there is a dimension of moral skills, beliefs about fairness and justice, the kind of things that we mean when we talk about legal socialization of adolescents. But bear in mind that the development of moral skills goes back far longer, and children at the age of 18 months have clear expectations about what is fair and what is unfair. And finally, there is a 4th dimension, namely social skills. For example, having a theory of mind, being able to imagine what others feel and what others experience, a sense of empathy, and the ability to resolve conflicts. So developmental prevention is about having a developmental perspective across the entire life course. Developmental prevention is not just focusing on early stages of the life. It is about developing adequate interventions at all stages of life. It's based on a multi-systemic approach with initiatives at the individual, the family, the school, and the neighborhood levels. It aims to combine strategies that strengthen protective factors, but also aims at reducing risk factors. It integrates universal, indicated, and selective prevention, and that's important because we know that a very small number of children and adolescents that are at the top end of risk are responsible for the overwhelming proportion of crimes. And so focusing resources on those with the highest needs is important. And finally, it follows a research and development logic and gradually aims to build the evidence base of what works and what doesn't. So I want to focus on one particular dimension of developmental prevention, where I believe that there is particularly good evidence that links developmental epidemiology to prevention science. And this framework is focusing on the notion of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, as it is known in the scientific literature. I believe this notion of adverse childhood experiences provides an interesting framework for risk-focused developmental prevention. So let me just briefly go through the question of what we mean by adverse childhood experiences. Of course, children experience all kinds of negative things, and that's part of their normal process of growing up. However, what we mean by adverse childhood experiences are particularly stressful experiences that occur during childhood, which directly hurt a child, for instance, maltreatment or corporal punishment, or that affect them through the environment in which they live, for example, growing up in a house where there is a lot of domestic violence. What are the main dimensions and indicators of adverse childhood experiences? In the literature that goes back about 20 years, one usually distinguishes 3 main dimensions of adverse childhood experiences. The first dimension is abuse, so directly harm doing to the child. That includes sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. But David Finkelhor has recently argued that outside the family, things like bullying experiences in primary school and secondary school, but also before the start of school, need to be included in the notion of abuse and harm experienced by children. The second dimension is neglect, emotional neglect by the parents, physical neglect by the parents, but also things like peer exclusion and rejection that lead to the isolation of children. And finally, a third dimension are household dysfunctions. So things that the child experiences, witnesses, is exposed to, but not necessarily is directly a victim of. That can be domestic violence among the partners, substance use by one or both of the partners living with the child or other family members. It can be that a parent is incarcerated, or it can include outside the family exposure to community violence that is linked to the functioning of the household. The significance of these adverse childhood experiences was initially discovered by Felitti et al. In an important study that was published in 1998, so over 20 years ago. Felitti was I think still is a medical doctor who conducted a survey amongst almost 10,000 adults of all ages who were participating in a large private integrated care system in the west of the United States. And what Felitti did was to administer a questionnaire where he asked the participant 17 forms of childhood adversities. He was motivated, by the way, to do this because he realized that among patients that he saw who were unable to comply with some instructions about health, he found a very strong proportion of people who had experienced childhood maltreatment. This study was quite revolutionary. It showed, first of all, that different adversities measured in this scale tend to come together. And it showed primarily in that study that childhood adversity was associated with a wide range of negative health outcomes. Think about health outcomes. These are physical health outcomes, such as having cardiovascular diseases, obesity, but also mental health outcomes such as depression. And there was very clearly an evidence that the more different adversities are experienced, the higher is the risk of negative health outcomes. And that includes cognitive impairment, disease, mental health, substance abuse, and also early death. Felitti et al. Ended up suggesting a cutoff of having experienced 4 or more ACEs for it's an indication that the patients, the people that he examined, were really at a high risk of experiencing a substantial increased risk of negative health outcomes. So you could ask, well, why does this matter for crime prevention? I've been talking about health outcomes. And I want to show this to you by means of a study conducted by Mark Bellis in Wales in the United Kingdom. This was also a large study of about 2,000 participants, again at all ages, a representative study. And they showed that in comparison to people with no adverse childhood experiences, those with more than 4 adverse childhood experiences, for example, are 4 times more likely to be high-risk drinkers. They're 6 times more likely to smoke tobacco or e-cigarettes, and they were more likely to have had sex under the age of 16 years. But now look at this. They're 11 times more likely to have smoked cannabis. They're much more likely, 4 times more likely to have been a victim of violence. They're 15 times more likely to have committed violence against another person in the last 12 months. They're 16 times more likely to have used cocaine or heroin, and they are 20 times more likely to have been incarcerated at any point in their lifetime. These are, by any standards in the social sciences, very big effects. And you can see here that these effects are particularly strong for activities linked to crime. Why should that be the case? I want to outline just briefly 5 main pathways that have been examined over the past 20 years. One pathway is that repeat exposure to frightening or threatening situations activates a number of systems in the body: the cardiovascular system, the metabolic system, the immune system, and the central nervous system. So together they create what Shonkov has called toxic stress. And this toxic stress might affect the functioning of the body in a way that makes the body more vulnerable to illnesses, but also more likely to behave in ways that are negative to the body's health. Chronic stress may lead to detrimental structural and functional changes in brain regions that are related to stress management. And so there are biological pathways that link exposure to chronic stress caused by adversities to the brain development, especially among young children, and the ways they can cope with stressful situations. Experiences of victimization, especially multiple types of victimization, have been shown to be associated with reduced abilities of self-control and long-term planning, because victimization changes the way children perceive the future and assume that the world around them is safe and they can move in this world around them in a way that they can plan. Victimization also undermines trust in others, and it's often been shown to be associated with depression and withdrawal. And finally, experiences of victimization increase negative emotions, including anger and violent ideations. Myself and my team have been doing research primarily on causal mechanisms linked to the last 3 arguments. And I just want to show you one result because I find this particularly interesting. I originally come from Switzerland, which is quite a peaceful country. And a few years ago in the longitudinal study, we examined how many young people think about killing somebody they know. Now, what I can say here is clearly that if young people in Switzerland were acting on the murder fantasies that they have, Switzerland would be wiped out pretty quickly. So fortunately, they don't do what they imagine. However, I do think that having violent fantasies is associated in some way with violent behavior. What we examined in this study was how much multiple victimizations, so adverse childhood experiences, if you will, are associated with the likelihood of your brain, an adolescent's brain, producing fantasies, ruminations linked to murder and violence. This is the association that you can see for males, and you can see that it goes up from about 3% among those who have never been victimized to almost over 70% for those with 20 different victimization experiences. But interestingly, we find the same association among females, where multiple victimizations are associated with an increase in ruminations about killing somebody else. So how does this matter for crime prevention? One of the things that I believe that the research on adverse childhood experiences has shown is that reducing experiences of neglect, abuse, and household dysfunctioning at all stages of childhood could potentially make a really significant contribution to the prevention of poor physical health, mental health problems, and early death in adulthood. But also, and that's the link to crime prevention, it shows and suggests that addressing exposure to adversity over the life course could be a major contribution to reducing later crime, violence, and substance use. Let me add here that I think this focus on adverse childhood experiences is so important because it shows us that when we try to think about crime prevention, we should think in the context of broader public health strategies that aim to support a healthy, positive child development and reduce adversities that children experience as they grow older. And so this is how I want to focus now on one study that I'm currently working on, which is called Evidence for Better Lives, where we try to create the basis for promoting the well-being of children across the life course. It's a collaboration with colleagues in 8 universities across the world. What we try to do in that study is to launch a global comparative birth cohort study that is focused on low and middle income countries and that tracks the well-being of children from before birth into adolescence. We want to focus on medium-sized cities and collaborate with international, national, and local stakeholders to use the study to support sustainable citywide change related to violence against children, psychosocial health, and family well-being. And we do this because we think that running randomized controlled trials is important, that it adds to the evidence base, but that at the same time we believe that we need to move beyond experiment and try to understand how we can change entire citywide systems. And finally, we want to contribute to capacity building by creating in each of the cities that participate an interdisciplinary network of research teams, promote early career scholars, and encourage South-South collaboration. Here is a list overview of the cities that are participating in this study. So going from west to east, you see that we include Kingston in Jamaica, Kafaridwa, a small city, medium-sized city in Ghana, Worcester in South Africa, Cluj-Napoca in Romania, Tarlai outside Islamabad in Pakistan, Ragama in Sri Lanka, Hue in the north of Vietnam, and Valenzuela City, one of the constituent cities of metropolitan Manila in the Philippines. So you see that these cities include a broad variety of different cultural structures, cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic levels of development, but they all are outside the modern, the affluent Western societies. At the moment, we're working on what we call the foundational study, which is a kind of like a large-scale demonstration that we could actually do this to an even bigger scale. We recruited 100 participants in each site. We recruited them in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy at baseline. We translated questionnaires into 9 languages. We had ethical approval in all sites. I just mentioned this because it's a lot of work to coordinate this across all different sites. And Sara Valdebenita, who is originally from Chile, was essential in making it possible that we get all of these activities coordinated in due course. We did computer-aided personal interviews, and we collected biological samples to measure stress during pregnancy. And I'll show you a few measures that we included in this study. Here is the basic design of the study so far. So we did all these activities, translation, developing a protocol, going through ethics approval, training the field workers across these different sites. Then we did the recruitment in the first part of 2019, and in red you can see the first wave which we conducted in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. After birth, broadly after 3 to 4 months, we did a brief telephone-based catch-up interview with the mother, just very brief. And then of course we had COVID, but we've been trying to recontact the mothers at about age 24 to 30 months. And currently we have 6 sites still participating in the study: Kingston, Cafarigua, Cluj, Ragamahue, and Valenzuela, while 2 sites are currently not able to continue in this study. So what this will enable us to do is a number of things. For one, we learn something about the effects of exposure to adversities before the child was born, to the outcomes at about age 2 years, but also we've made sure that we learn something about the effects that the exposure to the breakdown, to the lockdown and COVID had on child development. I would like to briefly show you how this study is structured, or the main research question is structured. One of the main interests that we have is how maternal exposure to intimate partner violence is linked to poor outcomes at ages 1 to 2 years. And we've designed the study in such a way that we better understand what the mediating pathways are that possibly link the cause to the effect. Because we believe that understanding the mediating pathways is essential to develop more effective and more targeted prevention strategies. Here are a few selected results. And I want to start with the question, how many of the mothers had experienced a significant amount of adversity in their childhood? So we asked the mothers retrospectively about what happened when they were children. Now we know approximately how many people in the United States and Wales and other Western affluent societies have experienced 4+ adverse childhood experiences. And here is the result. In the United States and Wales, that's pretty consistent across many studies. About 10 to 15% have experienced 4 or plus adversities in childhood. Across the study sites in our study, it's 42%, so a much larger proportion. We can also ask the differences in the exposure to 4 or more ACEs across the 4 sites. And this graph shows you the proportion of mothers who reported to have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences: neglect, physical maltreatment, and domestic dysfunctions. And you can see here, for example, that in Kingston and Worcester, over 2/3 of mothers have grown up in such situations. While, for example, in Hue, in Vietnam, and in Talai, in Pakistan, the proportion is much smaller. These are big differences between different sites. And I want to emphasize this because I believe it's important to not just think about these patterns as something that operates at the level of psychology, but to also bear in mind sociological research questions and sociological dynamics that are involved here. And I want to demonstrate this to you with one research finding. Namely, the question whether these differences between the sites are associated with levels of social inequality. Now, here is the result, and I find this pretty striking, although, admittedly, the samples that we are using in this study are small and not representative. So this is just tentative. But what this shows is that in societies where social inequality is higher, we also found a much larger proportion of women in our study that had experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And that's, for instance, in line with the argument by Wilkinson that high levels of income inequality create overall unhealthy societies. Now, we also know from this study what proportion of pregnant women experienced serious violence while they were pregnant in the community and at home. The study suggests that about 1 out of 3 women experience intimate partner violence during pregnancy, and that about 50 to 60% report observing violence in their neighborhood. Again, look at the big differences between the different sites in the extent to which women during pregnancy are exposed to violence. We need to link these dots, and one of the ways we can link dots that are relevant for prevention science is to ask, what is the association between experiencing ACEs as a child and being abused during pregnancy? On the horizontal axis, here you see the number of childhood adversities that the mother had experienced, and on the vertical axis, you see the proportion of women who then have experienced violence during pregnancy. And what you can see here is that women who were exposed to adversity during childhood are far more likely to experience intimate partner violence during pregnancy. So what we are seeing here is that multiple adversities, stresses come together in the same person. So what we've learned so far is that large proportion of pregnant women in low and middle income countries have experienced adversities. Social inequality may contribute to differences in the exposure to adversities between the study sites. But there is a strong association between experiencing adverse childhood experiences as a child and experiencing perinatal intimate partner violence and experiencing community violence during pregnancy. And we also have seen that women who experienced either or both are much more likely to report depression and stress during pregnancy. The study is ongoing, and I just want to tell you that, of course, one of the things that we will be doing once the third wave data collection is concluded is that we will analyze the hair samples that will tell us something about biomarkers of stress during pregnancy and how they're related to poor outcomes for the mother and the child. And we will understand something about whether early child behavior characteristics are associated with exposure to ACEs during pregnancy. So what are the implications for prevention and intervention of these studies? I think, first of all, it's important to bear in mind that the first 1,000 days after conception are a critical period in child development, and especially child brain development. Early childhood risk factors affect the long-term negative outcomes into childhood, into adolescence, and often into adulthood. And that includes a broad range of different negative experiences. I've also tried to show you that we have plausible models of the causal mechanisms that are involved. So I think we are currently going beyond just showing risk factors to also trying to understand the causal mechanisms that link childhood adversities to poor child outcomes. And I think it's important to understand here that when it comes to experiences during pregnancy of the mother, especially with violence in the community and violence by intimate partners, we are addressing problems that are both linked to the agenda of addressing violence against women and addressing violence against children. These agendas have often been separated in the past, but I believe at the moment we can see a strong movement towards integrating these two agendas. And looking at perinatal violence is one of the ways of doing this. There is now one interesting question here, namely, what should we do if we understand that exposure to intimate partner violence is one of the important adversities that affect both the mother and the child? In the United States currently, there is a strong movement to introduce more screening instruments. And such screening instruments are available. They usually just ask a few questions that try to assess whether the mother, the pregnant woman, is at risk of being exposed to domestic violence. One of the instruments has been adapted in Chile, the woman abuse screening tool. And I'm not sure whether other instruments, or I assume other instruments, are also used in Chile. It's important to bear in mind that screening may be important, but alone it has no benefits. And this is one of the reasons why the World Health Organization at the moment does not currently recommend screening, although they're reassessing the situation as we speak. Screening can make sense, but there is a need for subsequent intervention and support. And unless these support systems are in place, the screening doesn't really make a lot of sense. I thought I might just briefly show you one of the possible models that link screening to intervention. And I've learned about this model from recent publications. It's the Domestic Violence Enhanced Visitation program called DOVE as an example. It's relatively short. It's a brochure-based and safety planning intervention for pregnant women and mothers with infants who experience interpersonal violence. It's embedded into rural home visiting services for vulnerable mothers. So imagine social services visiting mothers who are at risk or deemed at risk because of substance use problems, because of poverty or other mental health issues or other combinations of difficulties. These programs are delivered by home visiting nurses. There is an initial screening, and then there are 3 sessions during pregnancy and 3 sessions during the postpartum period, and they take about 15 to 25 minutes. The nurses are extensively trained, and it's not a prescriptive program, but the home visitors discuss each woman's individual experiences and then try to tailor the intervention to her expressed needs and the level of danger at each visit. So it's about strengthening and enabling the woman rather than prescribing a certain course of action. What is the role of the police in this? The police and the justice authorities play a crucial role, but as part of a multi-agency public health approach. They receive very often emergency calls and victim reports. They play an important role, of course, by way of arresting perpetrators. They play an important role in training police officers and having specialist units. They can enforce restraining orders and other immediate protection measures imposed by the judge. And I think it's important to think of the role of the police here as an agency that cooperates with other agencies, including victim support, social services, safe houses, in order to address the risks, to conduct risk management and safeguarding. So I come to the conclusions. Oops. First of all, I would like to hint at 2 possible policy implications for Chile. And when I propose these possible policy suggestions, I'm acutely aware of the fact that I have a very limited to almost no understanding of the kind of approaches that are currently in place in Chile. But I believe that an approach that is focused on addressing adverse childhood experiences across the life course of children could be a major strategy focus to reduce crime, but also then argue convincingly and based on the international literature, this is a strategy that's related to also other behavior problems and a range of physical and mental health problems in adolescence and early adulthood. I think of addressing domestic violence, and especially domestic violence during and after pregnancy, as one of the adversities that the child experiences before it is born and immediately after it is born, so in the period when it's most vulnerable in terms of brain and organism development. And so preventing domestic violence is a major strategy both to address violence against women, but also to give children a healthy start and break the transmission of violence that we have seen when we looked at the mother's experiences with violence, the transmission of violence across generations. I would like to end here with possible implications for research in Chile. And again, I would like to apologize to any of my colleagues here in the audience if I make suggestions here for research that is already underway. I did examine whether I could find publications, and I could find very limited publications on the topics that I am suggesting. I think, but I may be wrong, no current study has examined adverse childhood experiences and their association with adult outcomes in representative samples in Chile. I think there have been 1 or 2 studies on very high-risk samples. I believe that such a study could play a major role in mobilizing public action because it could underpin a broad prevention strategy across the life course and emphasize to policymakers the importance of focusing on multiple stresses across childhood in addressing crime, but also addressing other negative outcomes. I believe, but again, I'm not sure, there seems to be limited research on exposure to violence during and after pregnancy. So this is related, of course, to overall studies on domestic violence, where I know research has been done in Chile, but I don't think that there has been specific research on exposure to violence during and after pregnancy. And I believe that could be really useful and helpful to strengthen the prevention and response systems in primary care settings. I've been, one of the big parts of my work over the years have been longitudinal studies. I've done one longitudinal study in Switzerland, which has been going on for 20 years now. And as you could hear, I've just started another series of longitudinal studies in 8 different countries across the world. In my view, longitudinal studies are really important research bases to make the case for developmental prevention over the life course. And so I think efforts to establish a longitudinal study in Chile could really help to advance long-term early prevention efforts. And maybe if one did envisage such a study, one might want to link it to an early prevention program in order to examine the extent to which early interventions can address long-term negative consequences on children. Finally, I've tried to argue here that the months before and after birth offer opportunities for prevention that strengthen the family and the child. This is important here. In these months, women have a large number of contacts with health representatives. And this is a unique opportunity to intervene in sensible ways to strengthen the family and the child. Now, much of what is currently done in many countries is focused on making sure that the physical health of the mother and the child is guaranteed. But I believe there are a number of innovative prevention interventions that either focus on the mental health of the mother, the social context, or on intimate partner violence that could strengthen an integrated approach. And I think evaluation studies that focus on these kind of strategies could be very helpful to strengthen a healthy child development. So this was, I think, yes, my last slide, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Profesor Eisner, le tenemos que dar nosotros las gracias por esta interesante información, por esta inspiradora presentación. Durante su charla magistral hemos recibido distintas preguntas, pero como anfitriona quisiera yo hacer la primera, ¿no? Nuestra fundación desde el año 2007 trabaja en fortalecer el rol protector de los establecimientos educacionales a través del programa Paz Educa y actualmente el programa Convive, ¿no? Para prevenir la violencia y mejorar la gestión de la convivencia escolar. ¿Cuán relevante le parece este tipo de estrategias y en su experiencia, cuáles son los resultados más potentes? ¿Por qué debe haber una línea de política pública sostenida y sostenible en el tiempo para fortalecer el rol protectores, principalmente de plataformas que son distintas del sistema de justicia penal, ¿no? Como salud y educación?
I think that generally prevention and the activities of the criminal justice system must be seen by the side by side. One of the things I believe that is very clear these days is that if you want to effectively address levels of violence, you need to invest into effective prevention. These investments into effective prevention should not be seen exclusively as investments into preventing crime. I think that's a mistake. I think they're investments into healthy child development, because we know that so many risk factors associated with problematic developments of the child are risk factors that spread out into different types of behaviors. So strategies that aim, for instance, and I want to just mention a few things because you mentioned schools. Strategies that protect children from bullying victimization, which I haven't been talking about because I was focusing on the first years, but bullying victimization is such an important lasting factor that has a negative effect on child developing. Strengthening, for instance, children's ability to develop social skills in the school context is hugely important. But also, for instance, strategies that aim to improve the quality of schooling and reduce school exclusion or non-attendance in schools, in secondary school, is hugely important. So all these strategies must be put in place. At the moment, I believe one of the challenges that we have is that we can't put a precise figure behind the question, well, how much do you get out in terms of pesos or dollars out of a specific intervention strategy? There have been attempts to quantify these benefits, and I know this is useful for policymakers to have these cost-benefit ratios, but me personally, I'm cautious to come up with these figures because I think some of these figures are somewhat tentative, and I believe it's more important to make a moral case for supporting a healthy child development across all ages.
Sin duda. Nos preguntan también cuál es el nivel de importancia que tiene el apego en la etapa de infancia temprana para la prevención de la violencia y el delito, y qué acciones en su experiencia se debieran implementar desde el Estado con niñas, niños que se encuentran bajo su tutela. Son dos preguntas separadas. Una está relacionada con el nivel de apego, la primera, y la segunda, cuáles son estrategias efectivas para niños y niñas que están bajo la tutela del Estado.
Well, first of all, on the question of attachment, we have just published a paper that has been looking, based on the evidence for better lives data, at the link between exposure to intimate partner violence and adversities and prenatal attachment of the mother. So that's the extent to which the mother feels attached to her unborn child. And we could demonstrate in that study that there is quite a substantial association between experiencing adversities and the lack of ability, a reduced ability to attach to the unborn child. And we believe that this then in turn is in combination with issues related to mental health, depression, and stress of the mother is then having a negative effect on child development. I'm not an attachment specialist, but I do believe that addressing these risk factors and adversities is one of the important bases for improving attachment between the mother and the child. Attachment, well, I'll leave it with this for the time being. Institutionalized children, I believe that, so I'm not a specialist on research for institutionalized children either. One of the things I think that is very clear from research, for instance, that has been done by Noemi Pereda in Barcelona, is that institutionalized children are at an extremely high risk of later delinquency, but also at an extremely high risk of victimization in many different forms. In many societies, one of the responses has been to try to minimize the number of children that are institutionalized. And certainly in the United Kingdom and in Switzerland, all the strategies are going in the direction of preferring foster care arrangements over institutionalization. Now, I don't feel, and I think I would like to leave it at this. I know that, for instance, in Spain, there is a much greater preference for institutionalizing children in childcare homes. And I've had these discussions. I don't feel competent to make a judgment of whether foster care arrangements or institutionalizations are the preferable strategy. But I do think that protecting those particularly vulnerable children from adversities is extremely, extremely important.
Sin duda, es un gran desafío, ya sea en sistema de foster care o de institucionalización de parte del Estado. ¿Cuál cree? Tenemos más preguntas, tenemos para 5 minutos más de preguntas. Si quieres, voy haciéndolas una a una. ¿Cuál crees que son las principales razones por las que los tomadores de decisiones debiesen pasar de una política criminal eminentemente disuasiva, que utiliza estrategias del sistema de justicia penal tradicional, hacia una política criminal con esta visión más integradora, ¿no? Que pone el foco y en el corazón del quehacer la prevención?
I'm just trying to think about how we have argued that case in different systems over the years. I believe that one of the important things to demonstrate to policymakers is that crime and offending, the kind of behaviors that you see in the criminal justice system, is only one age-specific manifestation of problem behaviors that have roots before contact with the criminal justice system starts. It starts in childhood, in early adolescence, long before the criminal justice system authorities are active. And I think demonstrating this to justice authorities helps to make a case for early prevention. I think it's also important to demonstrate to justice authorities that the costs that crime generates is so strongly associated with other costs to society, including unemployment, including mental health problems, and so on. And all these problems need to be examined, understood from an integrated perspective. I wanted to use this opportunity to say something about the harm index, which Daniel Johnson brought up, which I do believe I would not want to contradict Professor Sherman, who is a good colleague and friend of mine. But here is an interesting challenge when you think about the crime harm index. I do think it has a very important role in directing police activities towards the greatest harm. However, bearing in mind what I've been saying about adverse childhood experiences, children being beaten, children being neglected, children being victims of bullying, how do you quantify the harm of these experiences? And is it really so that you can calculate these harms by focusing on the severity of the punishment? This is not an argument against using the crime harm index, just to get me right. But I think that parallel to looking at crime harm in the sense of the amount of punishment for a certain crime, we also need to look at the social harm that is inflicted on the victims in terms of suffering. And it's not always quite clear to me whether these two really match each other.
No, sin duda. Además, en el caso de bullying, por ejemplo, no tiene una sanción penal que nos permita incorporar ese tipo de estimación. Por lo tanto, es un delito al que no le atribuiríamos, que no aparecería en ningún mapa, ¿no? Sin embargo, los efectos que tiene en el mediano y en el largo plazo en la vida de los individuos que lo sufren es muy dramático. Una última pregunta, profesor Eisner, nos hacen llegar respecto al estudio de Evidence for Better Lives. ¿Se podría hacer en Chile? ¿Y por qué el estudio está centrado en ciudades medianas y menos occidentalizadas, ¿no? ¿Qué particularidades tenían estas ciudades versus ciudades más occidentales?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, and first of all, you will have noticed, those of you who've looked at the map, that South America is a blank spot, which was not intended, I have to say. But these projects have their own histories, and we initially had a site in South America, not in Chile, but in Brazil. And then for a number of reasons that didn't materialize. So I think it would, well, we always wanted to have a site in South America. It's not happened for the foundational study, but if we can go on to the main study, it would be very interesting to have a site in South America. Why did we focus on low and middle income countries? The reason for this simply is that when it comes to the extent of experiencing violence across the world, there is one important imbalance, namely that low and middle income countries, whether you look at violence against women, violence against children, homicide, or whatever other manifestations of violence, also war, it overproportionally occurs in low and middle income countries. And that's the place where there is least research. And so that's why we focused on these places, because we thought that this is most important. The final reason is very simple. It's so much more costly to do a longitudinal study in a high income country. And so, although we always wanted to do this also in a high income country, and Chile would be one of them, the problem is that it just is so much more expensive to do this. It would be very interesting. I could come up with more reasons, but these are three of the main reasons for not doing it at the moment.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Esperamos poder retomar contacto para poder llevar a cabo un estudio tan interesante en nuestro país que ilumine nuestras políticas públicas para evitar estos importantes daños que se generan si es que llegamos tempranamente, ¿no? Hacemos vidas mucho mejores, ¿no? Y los impactos no solamente son finalmente en prevención de violencia y delitos, sino que en ciudadanas y ciudadanos más saludables, con una mejor vía. Ahora, profesor Eisner, muchas gracias por acompañarnos en nuestra sesión inaugural. Qué buena manera de iniciar estas 3 jornadas. Le mandamos un abrazo